Gee, I think it's very important that we have cessation of hostilities immediately, because without that, this fight, talk wouldn't work. Because now we are entering a phase of escalation, which could be very dangerous for Iran, likewise for the US, because now both sides are running out of less risky options. So from the American side, of course, like what they have already threatened that they'd be attacking the sort of the energy, the power plants and the desalination plants and sort of the big tag infrastructure items there, and that could really degrade not just Iran's capacity in terms of its infrastructure for defending itself, but more importantly, it will basically mean that the very minimum amenities required for a decent human life would be degraded. On the other hand, from a US perspective, the next phase, if that entails some troops on the ground, that would be again a very risky option with a lot of casualties possible. And then basically, because once the two sides embark upon that course, then we could see a sort of escalation ladder, which would literally like then leave no room for sort of negotiations. So that is why I think, and I've been saying that for the last few weeks actually now, that this is probably the best point for going off ramp for both the sides, not just for the Iranians, not just for the Americans, for both sides. The sad reality is that Israel is the only party which stands to gain from a longer war from here on, from a protracted sort of violence, from a protracted or from a rather escalated violence on both sides. And that is why that has to be best avoided. This framework that has been presented by Pakistan, this is in the light of what was agreed between Pakistan and Beijing as well, and in light of previous discussions that Pakistan had held with both the sides. So I think it's a very good framework. It provides for an immediate ceasefire, and once that happens, and then the unblocking of Strait of Hormuz, these are the two basic essentials, because that would then set in place a round of negotiations which could take care of other important issues. For instance, the nuclear issue, which is the crux of the matter for many, and also from the Iranian perspective, the lifting of sanctions, and then of course all the other allied issues like Iran's missiles program and other U.S. reservations, and on the Iranian side as well, what they seek, like the guarantees that there would not be this attack again, this would not be repeated, because it has happened twice, of course, in the last some months. So I think that we are at a critical juncture. I have a feeling that Iran is still pushing for some sort of guarantee that if they agree, then this would not be repeated, because from their perspective, it was very, very important that the cost of aggression is raised so high that the next time, from their perspective, Americans or the Israelis, they would not cross the Rubicon, so to speak. They would not strike again because they would understand what cost it entails. That has been the Iranian strategy, I think, from the very beginning of the war. And we have to, of course, appreciate the fact that Iran has taken a lot of losses both in terms of, like the personalities, some of the top leaders in Iran, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the institutional damage, in terms of course, the thousands of deaths, the casualties, and also in terms of the fact that Iran had to embark upon a strategy which entails a huge amount of rather reputational damage, because Iran has always been trying to ensure that they are taken as a responsible state. But some of the actions that they had to take during this conflict of course, they fall short of that. Countries understand that, they were at war. Countries understand that, they only had very few options for retaliations, and they were trying to maximize those, but still closing the Strait of Hormuz, um, striking the Gulf countries' civilian infrastructure. Now, these are actions which would entail um, not only reputational damage, but a great loss of trust as well. What we have seen in the last, I think perhaps more than a year now, or close to that, at least, that Israelis have on numerous occasions, they have scuttled the dialogue, the ongoing dialogue, when Americans were having various rounds of dialogues with Iran. They just suddenly, they just struck. That was last June. This time as well, the Israelis, when they launched that targeted assassination of dozens of Iranian leaders, which started this war, that also scuttled the ongoing deliberations between Iran and the US, the ongoing negotiations. Then again, we have seen on certain occasions that some very pragmatic leaders within the Iranian establishment, they were assassinated at some key moments. And some of those could have played a very pivotal role in any peace negotiations. And then, of course, we have seen that a great deal of persuasion by Israel for the US to continue this war. So that has been there. There's no doubt about that. There's various instances which testify that Netanyahu wanted this conflict. Netanyahu wants this conflict to go on, and Netanyahu probably would want to see it being escalated further. And why is that? One reason, of course, is the question of his political survival. By continuing this conflict, just now we know that he has ensured that until the next October, he will stay in power. He has cases against him, cases of abuse of power, cases of corruption, very serious ones, with a great deal of evidence. And a lot of people in Israel felt that if he was ousted from power, he would not just be ousted from the prime minister's position, but he would also end up in jail. So with that, with that type of politics, of course, we have seen that this wag the dog strategy, so to speak, where you just start conflicts, you start wars just to stay in power, or just to avoid some political crises at home. So that has been there. The other thing is that the Israelis genuinely felt, and that is why there's a high level of support, which is now diluting a bit in Israel, but until a week or two back, 90% of the people of the Israeli population supported this war. And that was a huge surprise for many in the world. And why was that? The reason was that Netanyahu had projected this sort of perspective in Israel, and Israelis believed in that Iran was posing a multi-pronged threat to them through the proxies, through their supported governments in many countries. So that was the other thing, and they want to ensure that Iran's capacity is degraded to an extent where it cannot pose a threat to Israel in that way. And also, it's very clear that Israel wants to be the the dominant military power in that region, and for that, of course, it's very important for them to contain any other opposition. Well, I mean, it's frustrating, of course, but it also indicates that I think the last tweet, which was so much discussed all over the world, and that was, even by Trump's standards, we know that President Trump is not very diplomatic, in the use of language in his tweets and in his public statements as well. But this was a stretch. This was something that, probably, I think I've never witnessed something like this from a Western leader. What to talk of an American president, such a statement possibly such a statement delineating their policy ever. So very clearly, it was there to put a great deal of pressure on Iran, but also, of course, it indicated, that he was at the end of his kind of wits in some ways. He was a bit frustrated as well because, I think he never wanted this long war. I have said it on multiple occasions that from his vantage point, maximum 2 to 3 weeks war should have been sort of, enough. But as it happened, that was not enough. And that has really mounted a great deal of pressure on him, both political pressure. His core constituency is still with him. But, he knows that this could change. And then international pressure, of course, has been mounting, particularly because of this closure of Strait of Hormuz. Now, having said that, I think that it doesn't mean that he's not willing not willing to negotiate. He would still want to find an exit, an off-ramp, but an off-ramp which would provide him some sort of victory. Both sides will need that because, they have to sell it to their constituencies. And I believe that we are at a point where both sides can claim that, actually. The Americans, President Trump can claim that he has achieved all his objectives in terms of decimating Iran's capacity and, of course, denting their missiles capacity, the nuclear capacity as well to a certain extent. And if he has some agreement after that, that would be a, where they could further ensure that would be a bonus. From an Iranian perspective, they have shown the level of resilience which probably many did not expect. They have also shown the leverage that they can bring into any conflict in terms of, this closure of Strait of Hormuz, in terms of their capacity to inflict damage on the Gulf countries, on the US bases as well. And sort of, and within Iran, the feeling is that, this defiance, has been at least for a certain segment of population there, it has been historic. It has been exemplary. The hardcore support of the regime believes that, and any regime is basically dependent on its core support, and that is why I think both the sides can have a win-win situation. In my previous comments, I that okay, there are two tactics that President Trump employs. One is the madman theory, basically, to unsettle your adversaries. You kind of act a little I don't want to use the word, but that's what the theory says. So you act a bit crazy, apparently. But there's a method to that madness. The purpose is primarily coercive diplomacy, and it works as well. It has always worked for him in the past. That was done. But I think the latest tweet, it went beyond that, because the problem with that was that because when you use such a language, then you are also pushing the other side to be more defined, because they also have to have some face saving. They cannot seem to be intimidated by what you're saying. So I think this statement was probably beyond that madman theory, or was beyond his usual strategy of making conflicting statements and creating a lot of political space for himself, creating a lot of room for maneuvering, which he does very effectively. But this statement in many ways was a bit odd, I would say, and perhaps not recommendable in future. Well, that is true. We know, as per the international law, in a war situation as well, there are certain lines you are not supposed to cross. But unfortunately, these lines have been crossed, and not just in this war. Some of these lines have been crossed in the Ukraine war as well, as we all know. And it happens. Unfortunately, because the capacity is so disproportionate here that if the Americans and Israelis, they would prolong this strategy, or they would sustain this strategy, it could cause a magnitude of damage to Iran, which would probably be unprecedented in some ways, at least in modern history. So that is why, in fact, you would recall that I had been saying it in many of my comments in the past few weeks, that the next phase of war, if it continues like that, would entail a very, very high cost for Iran, and a cost which I believe is not necessary, something that is very much avoidable. And I think that Iran and the US both, or both of them, because the Iranians would take the brunt of that cost in terms of the material damage, in terms of casualties. But the cost which America would take in terms of reputational damage, in terms of the loss of its soft power. And we have to remember one thing, since the Second World War, America has not won many wars in terms of the hard power, but they have won many wars in terms of their soft power. They won the Cold War not because of their hard power. They won it because of their soft power. So the loss of soft power is, if the American policymakers would deliberate upon it, they would probably understand that would be greater than the loss of the material loss that Iran would suffer. So I think this is a line which should not be crossed by any of the sides. Now, just imagine if that happens, if they start destroying the power plants, and perhaps from a global perspective, they start destroying the oil installations, the gas infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, in terms of what they export. The Iranians would retaliate then, and they can seriously damage the oil and gas infrastructure in Gulf countries. Now, that is very different to a temporary closure of Strait of Hormuz. That is a loss of capacity which could take years to repair. And in that case, the global economy would literally be, dealt, if not a death blow, a very severe blow. Then we are not just talking about recession. We're talking about a depression, a global depression, perhaps. Yes. So that is something that this world cannot afford. What to talk of Iran and America and the Gulf countries and our regions. This would have global consequences. This is a very, very dangerous path. I had mentioned in the past as well that China's role would be very important. And why is that? Because I'd said the stake that China has, number one. The second, the leverage China has over Iran, because China is the country which buys 90% of their oil there. They're the biggest trade with, Iran's biggest trade is with China. Also, China provides all the materials Iran needs for its defense capabilities. Even now, we just, a couple of days back, we had this, I've been saying it even before that, but there's been this article in Telegraph which suggests that even now, the chemicals that Iran requires to fuel its missiles are still being provided by China. So it's that type of reliance on China. And that is why China has that leverage. If they persuade Iran for ceasefire, I think Iran will listen probably more to them than anybody else. And I believe that this diplomacy, and that is one of the reasons I believe the Deputy Prime Minister went to China, because China's support was essential to this diplomacy. And I think China's consent is there in terms of the diplomacy that Pakistan is playing, and through the back channel diplomacy that all countries have back channels. Even Americans and Iranians have channels, through the intels. So the Chinese must be trying to persuade Iran to agree to some sort of a ceasefire. Similarly, the other countries as well. Russia could be important because Russia has been providing in Iran with a great deal of support. The intelligence that they provided enabled Iran to very precisely hit targets which they were not able to in the last conflict in June, not to that extent. So that and they have strategic partnerships, so their role is important. Then the regional countries like Turkey, Egypt as well, So and why, and perhaps eventually we might want some European countries to join the effort in terms of providing as I said, a group of countries which would provide assurances to Iran and to the US as well, because both the countries have such a huge trust deficit, which needs to be filled by other countries in terms of their mediation and in terms of acting some sort of, not directly, but at least indirectly, some sort of guarantors. Yeah, I think the objectives were like multi-pronged, or at least threefold. One was Israel's security. That was one. And Israel, we have to remember, not only Israel has bipartisan support in America, but in some ways, Israel is also seen as a sort of, as a Western outpost in this region. So that Israel's security is a cornerstone of the US foreign policy. Let there be no doubt on that. The second was Iran's nuclear program. They felt could eventually threaten them as well. Could eventually threaten the US, because again, there's no trust between these two countries, and they believe that the regime in Iran could eventually be so ambitious that it could look beyond this region. The third one was the China containment angle, and that is important as well. There's this theory, what we call the Thucydides trap. When you have a superpower or a great power, which suddenly sees the emergence of a rival catching up to it, then that situation always leads to a conflict. And then the theory says that there could be multiple theaters, where they're kind of, like the proxy wars are fought. Now, so this could be, one of the theaters as well. And why do I say that? It's because if the US, what we saw in Venezuela, for instance, Venezuela was trying to establish a lot of linkages with Iran, with China, these countries. And the Western, the US and its allies, they take that as a camp. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And that is why they felt that, okay, we have to reassert the Monroe Doctrine, which Trump called the Trump Doctrine or whatever, in reasserting that doctrine. But so basically what they tried to do was to exclude China and Iran's influence there, or to minimize that, which probably they successfully did. Now, Iran itself, like I said, 90% of its oil goes to China. It has its biggest trade with China. China and Iran, they signed, I think, a $500 billion worth of investment framework with each other. So that is, that is huge, because China is energy deficient. Iran has, it's probably one of the few countries in the world which has not just oil, one of the biggest reserves of oil, but one of the biggest reserves of gas as well, natural gas as well. So very richly endowed with natural resources. So from American perspective, if they could deny China that huge reservoir of energy, it would make all the sense. It would also deny China the strategic ingress into Middle East. So I think that was also the U.S. interest, and the U.S. policymakers, perhaps they would not have entered this war alone because of the Israeli perspective. So there was this U.S. perspective as well, and that is why when they said that they wanted a regime change, a regime change would have been from their standpoint, that would have been spectacular success. Why? Because suddenly, if Iran if they had a favorable regime in Iran, then suddenly, like this whole region, not just it just in some ways it goes topsy-turvy. That now China is basically like instead of having a very strong strategic partner, would have a US ally in the region. Secondly, there would be a very significant dent in the camp, the China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea camp. So there were definitely strategic considerations in that direction as well. Well, first of all, I think the important thing here is that Pakistan, like, as I said, does not only enjoy brotherly relations with Iran, great relations with the US, and also fraternal ties with all these Gulf countries, and of course, most of all, Saudi Arabia. Now that is there. At the same time, what do the Gulf countries want? They want this war to stop, number one. Then they want, they want the Strait of Hormuz to be unblocked. That is extremely important for them, because these are all oil and gas exporters there. And not only oil and gas, many other products as well. And they all are routed through that. Now, there was one particular element here, which I think probably I'd mentioned that at the very inception of this war. And that was that I had felt that once Iran attacked those countries, because a lot of analysts felt that, then all these countries would try to persuade or pressurize, in whatever means possible, the US to stop this war. But I had felt that some of those countries would actually double down. Because why? Because they would think that, okay, they've taken the reputational damage and they have taken that material damage. But now the important thing for them is to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And as we saw, that actually happened. I don't have to elaborate upon that. We all know, there are lots of media reports to suggest that. But having stated that, now once it is clear that, there could be no outright victory for any side in this war, I think it would be in the interest of Gulf countries to have peace as early as possible. For example, for argument's sake, let's say, even if the US-Israeli side, if they devastate Iran, in the next phase of escalation, although it would be hard to see that Iran's, they cannot just take Iran's capacity to zero. It's not possible. But even, let's say, for argument's sake, if they were able to do that, even then, would an unstable Iran be in the interest of Gulf countries? I don't think so. That could create even greater problem for them, because Iran's geographical location, around this Strait of Hormuz suggests that any instability in Iran, because that would be long term then, so that type of sustained instability would be much worse than any a situation where you have a peace, even if that peace is fragile.